Ma'am, if you stay this calm while we search your car, it usually means you already know what we're going to find. Officer Mark Dalton's voice cut through the rain like a blade as the flashing red and blue lights painted the wet Georgia highway in violent streaks of color. Evelyn Hayes kept both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel of her 10-year-old Honda Accord, her knuckles relaxed, her breathing steady, even as water slid down the windshield in heavy waves. The digital clock on the dashboard read 1:12 a.m. She had just finished a 14-hour shift at St. Mary's Medical Center outside Atlanta, and exhaustion sat deep behind her eyes like wet cement. Her pale blue scrubs were hidden beneath a gray coat damp from the storm, and the faint smell of antiseptic still clung to her sleeves. Officer Dalton aimed his flashlight directly into her face again. License and registration. Evelyn handed them over without a word. Behind Dalton, a second cruiser rolled to a stop, tires hissing against the soaked pavement. A younger officer stepped out, Officer Chris Nolan, maybe late 20s, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He glanced at Evelyn, then at the back seat filled with grocery bags, folded blankets, and a pink children's backpack with cartoon rabbits on it. Dalton looked back toward the rookie and smirked. Vehicle matched a suspicious activity report 2 exits back. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low and calm. What kind of suspicious activity? Dalton ignored the question. Step out of the car, ma'am. Traffic continued rushing past only a few feet away, headlights smearing across the rain like white paint. A pickup truck slowed as it passed, the driver staring openly at the scene. Evelyn stepped out carefully, sneakers splashing into shallow water collecting near the shoulder. Dalton immediately began searching the vehicle. He opened the rear door and started moving things around with quick, impatient motions. A lunch container, a folded cardigan, medical charts. Chris hesitated before joining him. You work at St. Mary's? He asked quietly. Evelyn nodded once. I see you. Dalton gave a short, sarcastic laugh. Long nights saving lives. Evelyn didn't answer. Her silence seemed to bother him more than anger would have. He searched harder now, opening compartments, checking beneath seats, unzipping bags. Rain hammered the roof of the Honda so loudly it almost drowned out the static from Dalton's shoulder radio. Chris pulled a small pair of glitter-covered sneakers from the back floorboard. Tiny, worn at the toes. He set them carefully on the hood instead of tossing them aside like Dalton had done with everything else. Evelyn noticed that. Her eyes softened for just a second. Dalton opened the glove compartment suddenly, and a stack of papers slid into his hand along with an old photograph bent slightly at the corners. He barely glanced at it at first. Then his expression changed. The confidence drained from his face so fast it looked unnatural. Chris noticed immediately. What is it? Dalton didn't answer. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his flashlight as he stared down at the picture. A little white girl sat in a hospital bed smiling weakly into the camera, while a black nurse beside her wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders. On the back of the photo, written in fading black ink, were 6 words that made the rookie officer go completely silent. Thank you for saving our daughter. For a few seconds, the only sound on the highway was rain striking metal and the low crackle of police radios. Officer Mark Dalton stood frozen beside the open glove compartment, staring at the photograph like it had reached inside him and pulled something loose. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly. Chris Nolan stepped closer, squinting through the rain. Wait, he whispered, almost to himself. That is Lily. Dalton looked up sharply at the rookie, then back at Evelyn Hayes. She remained standing beside the shoulder of the road with her arms folded lightly against the cold, soaked hair clinging near her cheeks, her expression unreadable beneath the flashing lights. Cars continued speeding past at 70 miles per hour, but suddenly the highway felt strangely still. Chris turned the photograph over again. His throat tightened. He remembered that little girl. Everybody in the department did. Officer Dalton's daughter had nearly died after a drunk driver slammed into their SUV the previous winter outside Macon. Multiple surgeries. Weeks in intensive care. There had been moments when the doctors told Dalton to prepare for the worst. Chris remembered visiting the hospital once with a card signed by the precinct. He remembered seeing Dalton sitting outside the ICU looking hollow and exhausted, staring at the floor like a man praying for a miracle he no longer believed would come. And now here, under the flashing lights and pounding rain, Chris realized the woman they had pulled over was the same nurse from those stories. The one who stayed overnight with Lily when Dalton's wife collapsed from exhaustion. The one who braided the little girl's hair after surgery because her right arm was in a cast. The one who brought stuffed animals from the pediatric wing to make her smile. Dalton swallowed hard and looked at Evelyn differently now, as if truly seeing her face for the first time. "You were there," he said quietly. Evelyn gave the smallest nod. 411 nights. Chris stared at her in disbelief. Dalton glanced around at the mess scattered across the wet pavement. The lunch container. The blankets. The little backpack. The grocery bags soaking in rainwater. Shame crept slowly across his face like heat under skin. 20 minutes earlier, he had treated her like someone dangerous. Someone suspicious. Someone beneath basic respect. And she had known exactly who he was the entire time. Evelyn looked toward the dark road ahead. "Lily likes strawberry pudding cups," she said softly. "The cafeteria usually ran out before midnight, so I used to hide one in the staff fridge for her after treatment." Dalton's jaw tightened instantly. That detail hit harder than anything else because it was true. Lily had cried for those pudding cups after chemo made everything else taste metallic. Very few people knew that. Chris removed his cap for a second, rain soaking instantly into his short blonde hair. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath. Dalton looked suddenly exhausted, older somehow beneath the pulsing lights. "Why did you not say something?" he asked. Evelyn's eyes met his. Calmly. "Would it have changed the way you approach my car?" Dalton opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched painfully between them. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the Georgia sky. Chris slowly began gathering Evelyn's belongings from the hood of the cruiser, handling each item carefully now. The tiny glitter sneakers. The folded cardigan. The worn backpack. Dalton remained standing near the open door of the Honda, rain dripping from the edge of his uniform, staring at the photograph still clutched in his hand like it weighed 100 pounds. The rain began easing into a thin, cold mist, but nobody moved. Officer Mark Dalton still held the photograph in one hand while red and blue lights swept rhythmically across his face, exposing every flicker of guilt in his expression. Evelyn Hayes bent slowly to pick up one of the grocery bags that had tipped onto the pavement. A carton of eggs inside had cracked during the search, yellow spilling through the plastic onto the wet asphalt. She stared at it for a second, then quietly tied the bag shut again. Chris Nolan immediately stepped forward. "Ma'am, let me get that." Evelyn shook her head gently. "It is fine." But Chris could hear the exhaustion in her voice now. Not anger, not fear. Just the tiredness of someone who had spent too many years swallowing moments exactly like this. Dalton finally handed the photograph back to her carefully, almost respectfully. "Lily still has this picture in her room," he said quietly. Evelyn slid the photograph back into the glove compartment without answering. Dalton rubbed rainwater from the back of his neck. "She talks about you sometimes." That made Evelyn pause. Her expression softened for only a moment before the walls came back up again. "How is she?" Dalton blinked like he was surprised she would even ask after tonight. "Better," he answered. "She started middle school 3 months ago." Evelyn nodded once. "Good." The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Chris finished placing the last of her belongings back into the Honda. Every movement now was careful, deliberate, almost ashamed. The tiny glitter sneakers went back onto the floorboard. The cardigan folded neatly onto the passenger seat. The pink backpack zipped closed. Dalton looked toward the highway, jaw tight. The report said a dark sedan was weaving between lanes 2 exits back. He explained weakly. "Your car matched the description." Evelyn looked at him calmly beneath the flashing lights. "Did I weave between lanes?" Dalton hesitated. "No, was I speeding?" "No." "Did I give you any reason to think I was dangerous?" Dalton could not answer that one either. Chris lowered his eyes toward the pavement. Somewhere down the highway, a truck horn echoed through the darkness. Evelyn crossed her arms against the cold wind. "You saw an old car after midnight," she said softly. "You saw a black woman alone on the road. After that, your mind filled in the rest." Dalton looked like he wanted to defend himself, but the words died before reaching his mouth because deep down he knew she was right. He remembered the exact moment he pulled behind her Honda. The assumption had happened instantly. Automatic. Invisible. And now standing in front of the woman who once sat beside his daughter's hospital bed during the worst nights of his life, that assumption suddenly looked ugly. Smaller somehow. Chris cleared his throat carefully. Officer Dalton. Dalton held up a hand slightly, stopping him. His eyes never left Evelyn. I owe you an apology. Evelyn looked past him toward the endless line of headlights cutting through the rain. People usually apologize after they realize who I am, she said quietly. Not while they still think I am nobody. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Dalton's shoulders dropped slightly beneath the soaked uniform. For the first time that night, he looked less like an officer conducting a stop and more like a father standing face to face with his own failure. The flashing lights reflected across the wet highway, across the scattered rainwater, across the old Honda Accord, and in that strange quiet moment, nobody cared anymore about suspicious vehicles or highway reports. Because the real thing exposed on that road was not hidden inside Evelyn's car. It was something much uglier sitting inside the assumptions they brought with them before they ever turned the lights on. Officer Mark Dalton stood motionless beside the open driver's door while cold mist drifted across the highway shoulder in silver waves beneath the patrol lights. His police radio crackled softly at his shoulder, dispatch asking for an update, but he ignored it. Evelyn Hayes opened the trunk of her Honda slowly and placed the damaged grocery bag inside beside a stack of folded hospital blankets. Chris Nolan stayed near the rear bumper, helping silently now, careful not to meet her eyes too often. The tension from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something heavier and far more uncomfortable. Shame had a different kind of silence to it. Evelyn reached into the trunk and pulled out a thin navy sweater before wrapping it around her shoulders against the cold. Dalton noticed how tired she looked now that the adrenaline had faded from the stop. The faint shadows beneath her eyes, the stiffness in her movements, the small exhaustion people carried after spending all day caring for everyone except themselves. You worked 14 hours tonight? Chris asked quietly. Evelyn nodded while adjusting the sweater sleeves. One nurse called out sick. Another had to leave early. Dalton stared toward the wet highway for a long moment before speaking. And after all that, you still stopped to answer every question politely. Evelyn closed the trunk carefully. I learned a long time ago that surviving moments like this depends on staying calm. Dalton flinched slightly at the wording. Surviving moments like this. Not enduring. Not handling. Surviving. The words settled heavily into the damp night air. A black SUV sped past, spraying water across the shoulder. Evelyn stepped back instinctively to avoid it. Chris looked toward Dalton uneasily. Sir, maybe we should clear the stop. Dalton did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Evelyn like he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of her inside his head. The woman standing in front of him now looked nothing like the suspicion he had imagined 20 minutes earlier. She looked like every exhausted healthcare worker he had seen wandering hospital hallways during Lily's recovery. Quiet, overworked, carrying too much without complaint. Dalton swallowed hard. Lily still keeps the stuffed elephant you gave her, he said softly. Evelyn blinked, surprised for the first time that night. The gray one. She named it Marble. Despite herself, Evelyn smiled faintly. Tiny, brief, but real. Chris noticed Dalton's expression shift when he saw that smile. It made everything worse somehow, because kindness coming from someone you had already judged felt almost unbearable. Dalton rubbed rainwater from his forehead. She could not sleep unless that elephant was beside her after surgery. Evelyn looked down at the wet pavement. She was scared of the machines. Dalton nodded slowly. You remembered. Children remember fear differently than adults, Evelyn said. Most of the time they just need someone willing to sit beside them long enough. Her voice stayed calm, steady, but Dalton suddenly remembered walking past Lily's hospital room at 3 a.m. once and seeing Evelyn sitting in the corner under dim light, helping his daughter color pictures while monitors beeped softly nearby. He had barely noticed her back then. Just another nurse in blue scrubs. Another face moving through hospital corridors. Now that memory hit him like a punch of guilt straight through the chest. Chris glanced toward the cruiser lights reflecting across the rainwater. My mother is a nurse, he admitted quietly. People have no idea how much they carry every day. Evelyn gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Dalton finally reached up and switched off the flashing overhead lights. Instantly the highway became darker, quieter, more human. No more spectacle. No more public humiliation glowing against the rain. Just 3 people standing beneath cold Georgia skies with the truth hanging silently between them. And in that darkness, Officer Mark Dalton realized something that unsettled him more than anything else that night. The woman he had treated like a threat was probably one of the reasons his daughter was still alive. Evelyn Hayes opened the driver's door slowly and slid into the front seat of the Honda, but she did not start the engine yet. Her fingers rested lightly against the steering wheel while cool mist drifted through the cracked window, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and pine trees from the dark roadside beyond the highway. Officer Chris Nolan stepped back toward the cruiser quietly, giving her space, but Mark Dalton remained standing near the car like he still had something trapped inside his chest that needed to come out. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. It felt fragile. Dalton looked down at the soaked pavement before finally speaking. There was one night Lily stopped breathing for 12 seconds. Evelyn looked at him through the open window. Dalton's voice had changed completely now. Gone was the sharp authority from earlier. What remained sounded tired. Human. The doctors rushed in, he continued softly. Machines started going off everywhere. My wife started crying. I remember feeling completely useless. Rainwater slid down the side of his face as he stared somewhere far beyond the highway. Then one nurse walked over to Lily after they stabilized her and started talking to her about dolphins. Evelyn blinked once. Dalton let out a weak breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I remember thinking it was strange because nobody else in that room was acting normal anymore. But you sat there talking to my little girl about dolphins like the world was not falling apart around her. Evelyn looked down at her hands for a moment. She said she wanted to swim with them one day. Dalton nodded slowly. After that, Lily stopped crying. The memory hung quietly between them while headlights streamed across the wet highway in long silver lines. Chris stood near the cruiser pretending to check the computer screen, but he could hear every word. Dalton rubbed both hands against his soaked uniform pants. I spent months telling people that nurse saved my daughter emotionally as much as the surgeons saved her physically. He swallowed hard before looking directly at Evelyn again. And tonight I treated you like. The sentence died before he could finish it. Evelyn spared him from saying the word out loud. Like a suspect, she answered calmly. Dalton lowered his eyes immediately because there was no denying it anymore. The truth sat exposed beneath the quiet rain. Evelyn leaned her head back lightly against the seat. You know what the hardest part is? She asked softly. Dalton listened carefully. It is not the traffic stop. It is not the searching. It is not even the suspicion. Her eyes drifted toward the dark road ahead. It is realizing that no matter how many lives you help save, some people will still see your skin first. Chris looked away toward the highway, jaw tightening slightly. Dalton stood frozen beside the car. Every word landed heavier than the last, because deep inside he knew she was describing him perfectly. Evelyn continued quietly. I have held frightened children while their parents cried in hospital hallways. I have worked through hurricanes, through holidays, through nights when we lost patients and mornings when we saved them. Her voice remained steady, but exhaustion finally crept through it now. And still, all it took was one dark road and one old Honda for you to decide who I probably was. Dalton looked physically sick hearing it spoken that plainly. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the car while dispatch called his badge number again through the radio. This time Chris reached over and muted it completely. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Then Dalton did something Chris had never seen him do before in all their months working together. He removed his police cap slowly and held it against his chest. Not out of procedure, not out of protocol, but because for the first time that night, standing beside the woman who had once comforted his terrified daughter, Officer Mark Dalton finally understood the weight of what his assumptions had done. The rain had almost stopped by the time Evelyn Hayes finally reached for her keys again, but neither officer moved away from the Honda. The highway stretched endlessly behind them beneath dim clouds and fading mist, headlights sliding across the wet asphalt like pale rivers of light. Officer Mark Dalton stood beside the driver's window with his cap still pressed against his chest, his uniform darkened by rainwater, his face carrying the kind of silence that only comes after someone sees themselves clearly for the first time. Chris Nolan leaned quietly against the cruiser nearby, watching everything unfold with the uneasy feeling that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his career. Evelyn looked exhausted now. Not weak, not defeated, just emotionally drained in the way people become after carrying dignity through humiliation without allowing themselves to break. She started the engine softly, the old Honda vibrating gently beneath her hands. Dalton stepped forward before she could pull away. "Miss Hayes." Evelyn looked at him through the open window. Dalton swallowed hard. "I do not expect forgiveness." His voice sounded rough now, stripped of authority, stripped of pride. "But I need you to know I am ashamed of how I treated you tonight." Evelyn studied him quietly while cool air drifted through the car, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Dalton continued slowly, carefully, like every word weighed something. "I have spent years telling myself I judge situations, not people. But tonight proved that was not true." Chris lowered his eyes because he knew Dalton was not just talking to Evelyn anymore. He was finally admitting something to himself. Dalton looked down briefly at the pavement before speaking again. "You cared for my daughter when my family was falling apart. You gave us kindness during the worst period of our lives." His jaw tightened slightly. "And I repaid that kindness with suspicion." Evelyn rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel. "You repaid it with assumption," she corrected gently. Dalton nodded once because the distinction mattered. Very few cars passed now. The highway had grown strangely peaceful after hours of storm and flashing lights. Evelyn looked through the windshield for a moment before finally speaking again. "The dangerous thing about assumptions is that they rarely feel dangerous to the people making them." Dalton listened carefully. "They feel normal, routine, logical." Her eyes drifted toward him again. "Until one day you realize you have been looking at human beings through fear instead of truth." Chris felt those words settle heavily into the night air. Dalton's shoulders lowered slightly beneath the soaked fabric of his uniform. "You are right," he admitted quietly. Evelyn glanced toward the cruiser where her belongings had been carefully placed back inside the car. "Tonight embarrassed me," she said softly. "But it also exhausted me because moments like this are never just one moment." Dalton remained silent. "It is every look before this one. Every stop before this one. Every time someone decided what I probably was before I even opened my mouth." Her voice never rose above calm, but somehow that made it hit even harder. Dalton's eyes glistened faintly beneath the highway lights. "I cannot undo tonight." "No," Evelyn answered. "But maybe you can remember it next time before you approach someone already believing a story about them." The words hung there quietly between them. No anger, no shouting, just truth delivered with the kind of calmness that left nowhere to hide. Dalton nodded slowly. "I will remember." Evelyn studied his face for one final second, then gave the smallest nod in return. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, human to human. Chris stepped away from the cruiser and opened the lane slightly so she could pull safely back onto the road. As the Honda eased forward, Dalton suddenly spoke again. "Lily still wants to swim with dolphins someday." Evelyn paused just long enough to glance back through the rain-speckled window. For the first time all night, a genuine warmth touched her tired face. "Then make sure she grows up seeing people clearly," she said softly. And with that, the Honda disappeared into the dark Georgia highway, leaving two officers standing silently beneath fading lights and the heavy realization that sometimes the biggest thing revealed during a search is not what is inside the car, but what has been hidden inside the people doing the searching. The highway had gone quiet again by the time Officer Mark Dalton finally climbed back into his cruiser. Rainwater still dripped from the edge of his sleeves onto the steering wheel, but he barely noticed. Ahead of him, the taillights of Evelyn Hayes' old Honda had already disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by miles of wet Georgia road and low-hanging fog. Chris Nolan sat silently in the passenger seat for several moments before looking over carefully. "You okay?" Dalton did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the empty highway where Evelyn had vanished. The flashing patrol lights were gone now. No spectacle, no authority, just silence filling the car like something alive. Finally, Dalton leaned back against the seat and exhaled slowly. "I spent all these years thinking being a good cop meant learning how to read danger fast." His voice sounded distant, almost hollow. "Tonight made me realize how often I confused danger with bias." Chris looked down quietly. The words felt too honest for either of them to escape from now. Dalton rubbed a hand across his tired face and stared at the dashboard clock glowing 2:07 a.m. In just a few hours the sun would rise, traffic would return, reports would be filed, and life would move forward like nothing had happened on that stretch of highway. But Dalton knew something inside him had shifted permanently. He could feel it. The kind of change that happens quietly, without applause, without witnesses, deep beneath the surface where pride usually hides. Chris finally spoke softly. You know, most people would have yelled at us tonight. Dalton nodded once. She had every right to. He thought about Evelyn standing beside the road in the rain with complete composure while strangers treated her with suspicion. He thought about her tired eyes, her careful voice, the way she protected her dignity without ever needing to raise her volume. And somehow that hurt more than anger would have, because kindness from someone you wronged leaves no place to hide from yourself afterward. Dalton reached into the center console slowly and pulled out the folded precinct family newsletter from earlier that week. Lily's school photo smiled back at him from the corner of the page. Missing front tooth, bright eyes, purple sweater. He stared at the picture for a long time before speaking again. When Lily gets older, I do not want her learning fear from me. Chris turned slightly toward him. Dalton's jaw tightened. I do not want her seeing people through categories before she sees them as human beings. Outside the cruiser, cold wind moved through the pine trees lining the road, carrying the fading smell of rain across the dark shoulder. Chris leaned back quietly. You think you will ever see Evelyn again? Dalton looked toward the empty highway once more. I do not know. Then after a pause, he added softly, but I think she already gave me the only thing she intended to tonight. Chris frowned slightly. What is that? Dalton stared ahead as distant headlights emerged far down the interstate. A chance to see clearly before my daughter grows up watching me see people the wrong way. Neither man spoke after that. The patrol car remained parked beneath the dim highway lights while the storm finally drifted away into the distance. Somewhere miles ahead, Evelyn Hayes continued driving home through the quiet Georgia night, exhausted from another long shift, exhausted from another reminder of how quickly people could misunderstand her, but still carrying herself with the same calm dignity that had once comforted a frightened little girl in a hospital bed. And far behind her, two officers sat silently in the dark, learning a lesson no police academy had ever truly taught them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is remain kind in a moment that gives them every reason not to be. And sometimes the deepest kind of justice is not humiliation. It is leaving someone alone with the truth long enough for it to finally change them.